If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. Dry Creek had the kind of heat that settled into skin and stayed there. Dust clung to boots, hair, and the edges of every doorway. The drought had dragged on for months, leaving the main street cracked and lifeless. Mara Ellison walked through it each day on her way to the saloon, keeping her eyes lowered as she passed men who carried too much anger and not enough sense. She had been in Dry Creek for nearly a year, long enough to know its routine, long enough to learn how to move without drawing attention. She worked at the Silver Spur Saloon because it was the only place that offered a room and steady pay. Her parents had died when she was 17, an accident during a storm that left her alone with no family to turn to. She drifted from one settlement to another until she learned that silence and careful distance were safer than trust. Her mission now was simple: survive without depending on anyone. Keep her job. Avoid trouble. Stay unnoticed. By early evening, the saloon was loud. Lamps flickered against the wooden walls, revealing the sweat on men's faces and the cards they slapped onto the tables. Mara moved between them with her steady, practiced walk. She kept her hands close to her sides so no one would grab her wrist, as some had tried in the past. She counted every step, every glass she carried, every man whose mood seemed unstable. Stress settled between her shoulders, but she knew how to hide it behind a quiet, polite expression. Near the door, the room shifted. A stranger walked in. Cole Hart stepped across the threshold with a slow, measured pace. His coat was dusty from days on the trail, and the scar across his cheek caught the lamplight when he turned his head. His eyes scanned the room with caution, as though he expected danger behind every corner. He carried no arrogance, no need to prove himself, just a tired awareness, like a man who had learned to calculate threats before they reached him. Cole had come to Dry Creek with a purpose. He was searching for supplies and a place to rest before continuing north. Years ago, he had defended a rancher's son during a violent dispute, and the man he injured had sworn revenge. Cole had spent years trying to outrun the consequences of a single mistake. His goal now was clear: stay alive long enough to reach a remote valley he once called home, a place where no one hunted him. He took the empty corner table farthest from a noise. Mara noticed how stiffly he lowered himself into the chair. Pain, probably ribs. She had seen enough brawls to recognize a man trying to hide an injury. She set a glass of water on a tray and brought it to him because she sensed he wouldn't ask for anything. "Water," she said, placing it in front of him. He gave a faint nod. His voice, when it came, was low and rough. "Thank you." He drank slowly, as if swallowing hurt. Mara stepped back, but her eyes stayed on him for a moment longer. Something about his guarded silence stirred a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in years: concern. She dismissed it quickly, reminding herself not to get involved in anyone's troubles. But the saloon didn't care about her resolve. A group of local ranch hands noticed the quiet stranger. 3 of them pushed away from the bar with too much whiskey in their systems and too much boredom in their eyes. They moved toward Cole's table with sharp grins. Mara saw it before Cole did, and her pulse lifted. She knew these men. They provoked fights for entertainment, and a newcomer who kept to himself was an easy target. Cole sensed him approaching. His back straightened, his jaw tightened, and his hand hovered near the edge of the table. Not for a gun, just steadying himself. He didn't want trouble, but the tension in his shoulders told Mara he expected it. "Stranger," one of the ranch hands said, leaning in. "Town's friendly. You could at least buy a round." Cole didn't respond. He stayed seated, eyes down, breathing controlled. Another man slapped the table. "You deaf or just rude?" Mara felt a sharp spike of fear. Not for herself, this time for him. She saw the way he braced, not with anger, but with resignation, as if he had lived this scene too many times already. Her hands trembled slightly, but she didn't let it stop her. She stepped in before she could reconsider. "That's enough," she said quietly. "Let him be." The men turned toward her. One narrowed his eyes, irritated by her interruption. "This ain't your concern, Mara." "It is now," she answered, voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't threaten. She simply stood there, calm and unflinching. The stillness of her stance unsettled them more than anger would have. After a tense moment, they grumbled, cursed, and backed away. Mara exhaled slowly. Her heart was beating too fast, but she kept her expression neutral. She stepped aside to continue her work, resisting the urge to look back at Cole again. But he watched her. For the first time that night, his expression changed. It wasn't gratitude alone. There was surprise, confusion, and something else she couldn't read. He was a man used to being alone in his fights. Having someone step between him and danger felt foreign. Mara didn't know why she had intervened. Maybe she recognized the exhaustion in his eyes. Maybe she saw her own struggle reflected in him. Maybe she was tired of watching cruelty go unchallenged. Whatever the reason, the moment settled into both of them, quiet but undeniable. And though neither of them spoke another word, the night had shifted. Their paths, once separate, were now quietly moving toward each other. The saloon emptied slowly after the tension faded, leaving only a few men lingering at the tables and the dull creak of the door swinging in the night breeze. Mara continued her work with careful focus, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the quiet stranger in the corner. She had stepped in without thinking, and now she was trying to steady her breath and make sense of her own reaction. She wasn't someone who invited trouble, yet something about the man had pushed her past her usual caution. She wondered whether he would leave before dawn, whether this place would drive him out the same way it had driven her toward silence. Cole finished his water and stood up slowly, bracing his ribs with one hand. The injury was old but aggravated, likely from a fight on the trail. Mara saw the wince he tried to hide as he approached the counter to return the glass. His movements were controlled, almost too controlled for a man who wanted no one to notice his pain. When he handed her the glass, he kept his eyes lowered, but his voice was steady. "Thank you for earlier." She nodded once. It needed to be done. He studied her for a moment, trying to understand why someone would step in for him. She appeared calm, but he recognized stress in the tightness of her jaw and the way she held her breath before speaking. She wasn't fearless, just tired of watching things play out the same way. Cole understood that feeling more than he wanted to admit. He turned to leave, but Mara saw the cut on his arm where a bottle had glanced off him earlier. She hesitated. A question rose in her. Help him or stay out of it. The saloon rules were simple. Take care of yourself first. But she had already broken that rule once tonight. "You should clean that cut," she said quietly. His eyes shifted to the wound as if seeing it for the first time. "I'll manage. It could get worse." Her tone was calm, but the concern was real. Cole didn't argue. Some part of him recognized the sincerity in her voice, and he followed her outside to the stable where the lantern light cast a steady glow over the wooden stalls. Mara fetched a small tin box she kept for emergencies. She had tended to her own injuries often enough to know the steps by memory. As she worked, Cole watched her hands, careful, steady despite the faint tremble from the long night. "Hold still," she murmured. He did. The quiet settled between them, but the silence no longer felt tense. It carried understanding. Two people used to surviving alone, sharing a moment where they didn't have to. As she wrapped the cloth around his arm, she noticed the hardened edges of his expression soften. He wasn't used to being tended to. She recognized that immediately. When she finished, she stepped back, letting him breathe. "Thank you," he said again, this time more certain. Mara didn't respond right away. She was studying him, weighing what she saw. The caution in his movements, the fatigue in his shoulders, the way he looked around the stable before relaxing, as though expecting someone to follow him. She had heard enough stories from travelers to know when a man was carrying more than simple bad luck. "You're passing through," she said, half statement, half question. For now, she waited. He didn't offer more, but she sensed that his purpose wasn't as simple as finding supplies. There was something he wanted to leave behind, something that kept him moving from town to town. Mara didn't push. She understood the weight of things better left unspoken. A gust of wind blew through the open doorway, carrying dust and the distant sound of a wagon while creaking down the road. Mara folded her arms against the chill. Cole noticed and removed his coat, offering it to her without hesitation. "You should take it," he said. She blinked in surprise. No one had offered her warmth in months. She shook her head. "You need it more." "I'll be fine." He draped the coat over the railing instead of forcing the issue. It was enough to show his intention without crossing her boundaries. When they stepped back into the night, Mara's pulse steadied. The brief exchange had answered the questions that lingered in her mind. Why he was so guarded, why he sat alone, why trouble followed him even when he avoided it. He was a man trying to stay unseen, not because he wanted to hide, but because he had learned that being noticed usually led to danger. Cole, on the other hand, had gained his own answers. Mara wasn't just a quiet waitress trying to get through each day. There was strain in her eyes that spoke of memories she never discussed, and a resilience built from years of handling her life alone. She didn't help people to feel brave. She helped because she knew what it meant to be trapped without support. Before they parted, a single moment of unspoken understanding passed between them. Both knew they would see each other again in the morning. Not because they planned it, but because neither wanted this fragile, shifting connection to end. Cole walked into the night with a steadier step than before, and Mara returned to her room above the saloon, feeling the first hint of something unfamiliar, an awareness of another person in the world who didn't bring danger, only quiet presence. The night in Dry Creek had ended, but everything beneath its surface had changed. Morning settled over Dry Creek with its usual heaviness, the pale light pushing across rooftops and stirring dust along the street. Mara stepped out of the saloon early, hoping for a moment of quiet before the day began. Her sleep had been light. Broken by thoughts she tried not to examine too closely. She had helped a stranger twice in one night, something she never allowed herself to do. A part of her worried that trouble would follow, but another part, small, unfamiliar, felt steadier than usual. Cole emerged from the stable at nearly the same time, adjusting his saddle and testing the motion of his wrapped arm. He had considered riding out before sunrise, but something kept him from leaving. The town felt tense. He sensed eyes on him the moment he walked across the yard. He recognized the pattern too well. Word had spread about the confrontation, and men who held grudges rarely waited long before acting on them. Mara approached with cautious steps. "You're leaving?" she asked, though she already expected the answer. "Soon," he replied. "This place won't stay quiet." His tone confirmed her worry. She had heard movement outside her window late in the night. Whispers, boots scuffing against the dirt. She hadn't dared look outside, but she knew the signs of men planning something. For a moment, she considered telling him, then hesitated. She didn't want to push fear into his decisions, but she also didn't want him walking blind into danger. "There were people outside last night," she said, steadying her voice. "I didn't see who, but they were angry. They were talking about you." Cole's jaw tightened, not in surprise, but in acceptance. It fit too easily with the life he had been running from. A familiar sense of urgency settled into him as he tightened the saddle strap. Mara watched him and understood something she hadn't fully realized. He had no one else to warn him, no one else to stand beside him when trouble closed in. The weight of that truth pulled at her thoughts. A shout echoed from the saloon's rear entrance. Two ranch hands rounded the building, the same kind who had caused trouble the night before, joined by another man carrying a length of chain. Their steps were fast, their expressions full of the kind of anger that didn't fade with sleep. Cole stepped forward, trying to keep Mara behind him without drawing attention to the gesture. The tension in the air thickened as the men approached. "You should have left when you had the chance," one of them barked. Cole kept his posture controlled. "I don't want to fight." "That's too bad," another spat. "We do." Before anything snapped, the saloon owner burst through the back door, shouting at the men to take their business elsewhere. The interruption slowed them long enough for Cole to grab his horse's reins. He turned to Mara, meeting her eyes in the rising daylight. She saw conflict written across his expression. Stay and risk more violence, or leave and abandon the small connection forming between them. He wasn't a man who ran from fear. He ran from pointless danger, from problems he couldn't solve with reason. Mara understood that instinct. She had lived her entire life by it. "You can't stay here," she said quietly. "They'll keep coming." "I know." Her next words rose before she could stop them. "Take me with you." Cole froze. He studied her face for any sign of hesitation, any hint that she didn't understand the risks. Mara held his gaze with rare certainty. She had nothing tying her to Dry Creek. No family, no safety, no future. She had lived too long behind the same walls, breathing the same stale fear every night. She saw no path forward except the one that led out of town. She continued, her voice steady. "I don't have a place here. If I stay, nothing changes. If I leave now, maybe something can." Cole weighed her request with the seriousness it deserved. Taking someone with him meant responsibility, risk, and constant caution. But Mara wasn't asking out of naivety. She knew what danger looked like, and she wasn't running toward adventure. She was stepping away from a life that didn't protect her. He nodded once. "If you come, you stay close. No wandering off. The trail can turn bad fast." "I understand." They moved quickly. Mara packed her belongings. Few clothes, a small keepsake from her parents, and the stitched cloth kit she used for tending wounds. Cole helped her strap the bag to his horse, adjusting the weight to balance the ride. Their movements aligned naturally, as though this wasn't the first time they had worked together. When they mounted up and began riding out of town, the men who had caused trouble watched from behind the saloon. None followed immediately. The presence of other townsfolk on the street held them back, but their eyes tracked the pair until they disappeared toward the open trail. The land outside Dry Creek stretched endlessly, offering both promise and uncertainty. Mara felt a knot in her stomach, fear, excitement, and something steadier resting beneath it. Cole rode slightly ahead, guiding the path, but he glanced back often to make sure she kept pace. They traveled until the town was a distant blur behind them. Only then did Cole speak. "We head north," he said. "There's a valley up there, a place I plan to reach. It's quiet, and no one looks for trouble." Mara listened. "And what about the men who want you found?" "They're not giving up," he answered. "But they won't find us easily out here." His honesty eased something inside her. She needed clarity, and he offered it without hesitation. She realized she had wondered about his past, about why trouble followed him. Now she knew enough to understand the path ahead. As the sun rose higher, the wind cooled their faces, carrying away the stale air of Dry Creek. Mara tightened her grip on the reins, feeling the start of a new direction settle into her chest. She didn't know what waited for them on the trail, but she knew she would not face it alone. For the first time in years, she rode towards something instead of away from it. The trail north carried them across long stretches of open land, where the wind moved steadily across the grass and the sky felt wider than any roof they had ever lived under. Mara rode beside Cole with growing confidence, learning the rhythm of the horse beneath her and adjusting her posture the way he had shown her. She stayed close, just as she promised, and Cole kept a slow enough pace for her to manage the rugged terrain. With each mile they put behind them, the weight of Dry Creek loosened from her shoulders. By late afternoon, they reached a ridge overlooking a quiet valley tucked between rolling hills. The land below held a small creek, a patch of clear meadow, and a weathered cabin that stood near a cluster of old cottonwoods. Cole stopped his horse and studied the view with a steady, searching gaze. Mara sensed the importance of this place from the way his breath settled. "This is it," he said quietly. Mara looked across the valley. "You're home." "Once," he replied, "before things went wrong." She waited, giving him room to speak if he chose. He tightened his grip on the reins before continuing. "I live here with my brother for a few years. After the dispute on the ranch, I left to draw trouble away from the valley. My brother moved on not long after." Mara absorbed the details carefully. She understood the decision, leaving to protect someone. She had made similar choices in her past. Leaving places before her presence caused trouble for those around her. Now she recognized that Cole carried the same instinct, shaped by years of necessity rather than pride. They guided their horses down into the valley. The air grew cooler near the creek, and the quiet felt almost unfamiliar after weeks surrounded by shouting men and creaking saloon floors. When they reached the cabin, Cole dismounted first, testing the ground and scanning the area for any sign of recent visitors. Everything was still. Footprints were old. The cabin door hung on its hinges, but remained intact. Inside, dust coated the surfaces, but the structure was solid, sturdy walls, a stone fireplace, and a wooden table with one missing leg. Mara ran her hand across the counter near the window and felt a calm she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't used to open space or silence that wasn't threatening. Something about this valley felt steady, grounded, and real. "We can fix this place," Mara said. Cole nodded. "It won't take much. A few days of work." They spent the next hours cleaning the cabin. Mara swept out the dust while Cole repaired the broken leg of the table. She worked with focus, finding comfort in tasks that had clear results. Cole watched her occasionally, noticing the way her posture changed once she realized she wasn't being watched by unfriendly eyes. She moved with more ease, more certainty. As daylight faded, they built a fire in the hearth. The crackle of burning would fill the silence. Mara prepared a simple meal while Cole checked the perimeter outside, making sure the valley remained as empty as it appeared. When he returned, he closed the door firmly behind him, a gesture of security rather than fear. After they ate, Cole sat near the fire, stretching his injured arm with slow movements. Mara noticed the stiffness and spoke gently. "It's healing, but you're pushing it too hard." He gave a quiet shrug. "Old habits. You don't have to keep everything to yourself," she said, not as a reprimand, but as an observation. Cole was silent for a moment. He rested his forearms on his knees and stared into the fire. Mara waited without pressure, sensing there was more he wanted to say. "They were after me because the man I injured had brothers," he said. "They claimed I started the fight. The law couldn't prove it either way. I left before they made things worse." "And now?" she asked. "They'll come looking again once they learn I'm alive." Mara felt a brief spike of unease. She had wondered whether the danger would follow them, and now she had the answer. But her fear didn't pull her away. Instead, it settled into determination. She looked at the strong cabin walls, the open land, and the quiet valley. She realized they weren't running anymore. They were building a place worth defending. "We'll be ready if they come," she said simply. Cole lifted his eyes to meet hers. Her voice held certainty, not bravado. It steadied him in a way he didn't expect. They slept that night under the same roof, each on opposite sides of the room, but the firelight and the quiet space between them felt safer than any night they had spent on the trail. Mara rested without waking in fear. Cole slept without listening for footsteps every hour. Morning brought work. Mara cleared the old shelves while Cole checked the fencing around the small corral behind the cabin. They found a broken gate, rusted nails, and a collapsed post near the creek. Cole explained how the corral used to hold their horses years ago. Mara listened closely, imagining a life where the valley had been filled with activity instead of silence. By midday, while gathering water from the creek, Mara noticed a small satchel caught under a fallen branch. Inside were letters sealed with dust. She carried them inside and showed them to Cole. His expression tightened as he opened one. "For my brother," he murmured. Mara stepped back, giving him space to read. The letter explained that his brother had left the valley willingly, not in fear, but to join a settlement farther north. He had wanted Cole to follow once it was safe. The message eased years of uncertainty Cole had carried silently. Now he knew his brother hadn't vanished or been harmed because of him. Mara saw relief settle across his features. A burden lifted, not entirely, but enough to change the way he stood. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the valley took on a calm that made Mara breathe more deeply than she had in years. She felt her place here forming naturally. Her past no longer trapped her. Cole, though still carrying shadows, now had a destination that didn't revolve around running. It revolved around rebuilding. They stood outside the cabin at dusk, the air cool against their skin. Cole glanced at her with a rare softness. "This place can be ours." Mara felt a quiet assurance rise inside her. "It already feels like it." The valley that once waited for Cole now waited for both of them. not as fugitives, but as two people learning how to live without fear. The following weeks settled into a steady rhythm. The valley grew more familiar each day as Mara and Cole repaired the cabin, cleared debris near the creek, and shaped the land into a place that felt lived in rather than abandoned. The once silent rooms now carried the sound of footsteps, steady breathing, and quiet conversation exchanged at the end of long hours. Mara felt her body relax in ways she hadn't thought possible. She woke each morning without the dread she used to carry and went to sleep knowing there were solid walls and a watchful presence nearby. Cole worked with a patience he hadn't shown anywhere else. He rebuilt the corral posts, reinforced the fencing, and restored the small wooden shed that once housed tools. His arm healed slowly, and the stiffness faded with each day he spent repairing the land. Mara watched him work and understood something she hadn't fully grasped before. This valley wasn't just a hiding place for him. It was the closest thing he had to a future. Inside the cabin, Mara organized the shelves and scrubbed the stone hearth until the gray film gave way to smooth surface. She stitched new coverings for the narrow bed and rearranged the table so the early light from the window fell across it. She noticed the shift in her own movements. She chose where blankets went. She chose where food was stored. This was the first home she had been allowed to shape since her childhood, and the realization brought a quiet warmth to her chest. They rode into the nearest settlement once a week for flour, nails, and whatever else they needed. On one of those trips, the sheriff approached them at the general store. He was an older man with a steady, familiar posture. Cole tensed immediately, preparing for confrontation, but the sheriff's expression held no hostility. "Thought you ought to know," the sheriff said. "The men who've been after you turned on each other. One's facing charges. The other's scattered. They won't be following you here." The news landed with a weight Mara could almost feel in the air. Cole stood still, processing it. Years of running, watching his back, sleeping lightly, and leaving every place before trouble reached him, over now. Not because something dramatic happened, but because the threat had finally collapsed under its own bitterness. When they rode back to the valley, the silence between them felt changed. Cole's shoulders eased for the first time since she had met him. The constant alertness in his eyes softened, replaced with something steadier. That evening, they sat outside the cabin while the fire inside warmed the windows. The valley stretched out before them, calm and open. Cole rested his hands on his knees and exhaled with a slow, deliberate breath, as if letting go of years he hadn't been able to set down. "I'm not running anymore," he said. His voice was low, serious, but lighter than she had ever heard it. Mara nodded. "You don't have to." He turned toward her, studying the way she sat with quiet confidence, the way the wind moved her hair just enough to reveal a softened expression. She felt his gaze, but didn't look away. She had always been cautious about closeness, but the time they spent in the valley had carved out a space where fear could settle and fade. "There's something else," Cole said. "I want you to know you're safe here. Not because you're staying with me, but because this place belongs to you as much as it does to me." Mara absorbed the words carefully. She had never been offered permanence before. People always gave her a room or a job with the understanding that she could lose it at any moment. This was different. This was a promise built from the same quiet actions that had pulled them together from the start. She rested her hand on the wooden step beside his. The distance between them closed naturally, not from impulse, but from weeks of shared trust. Cole didn't move away. Instead, he let his fingers brush lightly against hers, a gesture that held more honesty than anything spoken aloud. Over the next days, their routine continued, but with a new undercurrent of ease. They planted the first seeds in the small garden behind the cabin. Mara chose a place for herbs near the creek where the soil stayed moist. Cole secured the corral gate and brought home 2 horses he purchased with the last of his savings. One was calm and responsive, the other spirited but trainable. Mara watched Cole gentle the younger horse with steady hands and patient strength, and she found herself smiling at the sight without even noticing she had done so. When Mara practiced riding in the open meadow, Cole rode beside her to guide her through shallow dips and uneven ground. She felt the wind on her face, the strength of the horse beneath her, and the rare sensation of forward motion without fear. Cole kept a careful distance, close enough to help, far enough to respect her growing confidence. One evening near sunset, they stood at the top of the ridge that overlooked the valley. The air was cool, and the distant sound of the creek carried softly through the grass. Mara folded her arms across her chest, taking in the land below them, the cabin, the corral, the winding trail that led to the settlement. "It feels like it belongs to us," she said. "It does," Cole replied. "We made it that way." He didn't reach for her suddenly or speak with intensity. Instead, he stepped close enough that their shoulders touched lightly. The quiet gesture held the weight of everything they had survived and everything they were choosing now. Mara didn't pull away. She let the warmth of his presence settle around her. Years of fear, displacement, and loneliness slowly unwound in her chest. She felt something she had never trusted before: certainty. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, Cole spoke again. "I'm glad you came with me." Mara answered with complete clarity. "I'm glad I stayed." The valley no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It had become their home, built from steady work, shared trust, and the decision neither of them spoke aloud but both lived each day: to remain, to protect one another, and to choose the life growing quietly around them. Their story reached its end not with a dramatic moment, but with a simple truth. They were no longer two people surviving alone. They had become each other's home, and the valley finally held the peace they had both been searching for.